Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first Climate Snacks. And today we will have Josh Fisher talking about the fate of the terrestrial biosphere. And since this is the first Climate Snacks, I would like to give some what we expect from this seminar series. So, what we've been thinking about is that we don't want another journal club or an AGU type of meeting where we present the latest advances in our research in a very technical manner, and we end up seeing the same colleagues over and over again. What we want here is to attract a wider audience. We want a multi-diverse, multidisciplinary audience. Pretty much we want to attract everybody, high school students, teachers, your family members, everybody. So the idea is to make this an informal and dynamic talk on climate change research using accessible language, avoiding jargon as much as possible. And this will be also a space for diversity, equity, and inclusion. In terms of the guests, we expect to bring a mix of some of the pioneers and leaders in the field, the Rolling Stones in the field, as well as rising stars or future leaders. Our guest today is young enough to be considered a rising star, but he's already pretty consolidated. So he's a mixture of this. And the structure of the presentations of the talk will be, I will first start with giving some context, background on climate change and the topic that we will discuss. I'm your host today, but in some sessions, there might be other co-hosts, we'll see. And then the guest will start with an intro on the topic, and then we will talk about the challenges and uncertainties in the field. And we will end talking about the legacy that the guests want to leave in the field. And we will end with a Q&A section. So feel free to type your questions in the chat box. In a seminar series like this on climate change, it's pretty much mandatory to start talking about the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a group of experts on climate change, synthesizing all the evidence about climate change. And they publish reports every few years, and then the new report was published recently. And I didn't want to include any figure or anything here, but sometimes an image is worth 1,000 words. And in this case, I think this figure is pretty significant in the sense that you can see here. So here you have temperatures, and here you have time. You can see how bad is the issue of global warming. You can see the rate of increase in temperatures is unprecedented, at least in the last 2,000 years. And if you zoom in, you can see that this ramp up in temperatures has pretty much started increasing in the last few decades, since the 70s and 80s. And you can also see here in the green band that this increase in temperatures wouldn't happen without human intervention. Next, other conclusions from this report. Recent changes in the climate are widespread, rapid, and intensifying, and unprecedented in thousands of years. Unless there are immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees will be beyond reach. It is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change, making extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts, more frequent and severe. There is no going back from some changes in the climate system. However, some changes could be slow and others could be stopped by limiting warming. And this is key to limit global warming. Strong, rapid, and sustained reductions in CO2, methane, and other greenhouse gases are necessary. It's important to not lose track of what we need to stop global warming, and is reducing and limiting emissions. Sometimes it's easy to get lost and distracted with this discourse about carbon capture, nature climate solutions, but it is really essential that there's no other way than reducing and limiting emissions to solve this issue. So next, finally, I would like to give an overview of the carbon cycle, of also including a figure from the IPCC 6 report to give an overview of some of the topics that we will be discussing in these climate snacks. So as you can see, CO2 emissions from fossil fuel burning end up in the atmosphere, and because CO2 is a greenhouse gas, this increase in CO2 levels warms the planet, the climate. But there is an urban fraction, which means that not all the CO2 emissions end up in the atmosphere warming the planet. And this urban fraction is about half, meaning that about half of the emissions are absorbed by somewhere else. And it is pretty clear that the ocean can absorb CO2 through an exchange of gases between the atmosphere and the oceans, and also the land. So plants and soils, in particular plants, absorb CO2 through photosynthesis, and this can also lead to an absorption of CO2 from the atmosphere, creating a negative feedback that is reducing CO2 levels in the atmosphere. So in this seminar series, we will have experts talking about the land component, the atmospheric component, the ocean component. We will also have experts talking about energy and renewables and how to reduce CO2 emissions. And we will also talk about interactions between carbon cycles with other cycles, such as nutrients and water. And today, Josh will talk about the land branch of the carbon cycle, and also how water cycles are affected by climate change. So now, please, Josh, if you could start giving us an overview of the carbon cycle, the land component of the carbon cycle in a climate change context.
Great, yeah, thanks, Cesar, and thanks for having me. And yeah, so we'll see if we can make this interesting for everyone. I was talking with Cesar earlier about the format, how we're all used to like these Zoom talks or journal clubs, as I was talking about. But like, what would be different about this? I was thinking it's kind of like, like a talk show interview style, where hopefully we can have a conversation, so it's not so presenty. But we're first time for Cesar, and we're figuring it out. So we'll bear with us as we try to like make it interesting to you. And you already said like no jargon, and your like introduction had all this jargon, Cesar. So you're like, I've already pushed you on that one, but we're friends, so we can do that. All right.
Yeah, feel free to make suggestions on how we could improve this format. It will be a steep learning curve for us, but the idea is to make this dynamic and interesting and open for everyone.
Cool. All right. So my name is Josh Fisher. I am a presidential fellow of ecosystem science at Chapman University. I'm also the science lead for a space company called Hydrosat, and also have an appointment at UCLA. I was formerly at NASA JPL for almost 12 years, but have since transitioned into these new positions. So Cesar, you asked me to talk a little bit, give a little overview, introduction to the land, essentially the land component of these Earth system models. And I tend to think of the land component like the story of the princess and the pea. It's it's a very small component of the entire Earth system, yet it exerts this force that impacts the entire Earth's climate and the uncertainty in projections of Earth's climate. And so, what is this land? Here's some land, land, and in Earth system models, we would throw some weather at it, maybe some CO2, and up pops an ecosystem. And if you change any of those dials, you change the ecosystem and the carbon uptake and the water cycling and so on. But the processes that are involved in how this operates can start with the microns large pores of stomata that, when open, allow the land to take up CO2, and when closed, do not. It also allows plants to release water through transpiration. And I don't have a good picture of transpiration, so here's a picture of a leaf with a geyser on top, so you can pretend that's transpiration coming out. And then, of course, there's very detailed biochemical electron transport mechanisms for photosynthesis, which are not represented in the Earth system models that were shown in the IPCC graphs that you showed earlier, Thazar. So there are assumptions that have to be made on how you simplify these processes for the Earth system models. And then, while these all happen in the in an area of a leaf, not all leaves are created equally. So how do we scale up these processes from individual leaves to entire canopies and across the landscape? And how do we turn on those processes as light penetrates through the canopy and through the land surface, heating up the land surface? Ecosystems can intercept water, which it would be water that would otherwise go to soil processes, and also affecting photosynthesis and transpiration, gas exchange. But water, the rest of the water does go through to the soil. Ecosystems were kind of originally put into Earth system models, not for their carbon uptake or water cycling, but because they physically got in the way of the atmospheric models that needed to represent drag and friction for the atmospheric winds. We need to be able to understand the dynamics of phenology and litterfall, both in deciduous and evergreen systems. And we need to understand how much carbon is stored in plants, and when plants might run out of carbon or die from carbon starvation, and how long they can withstand droughts from the stored carbon. In Earth system models, we can't represent every species on Earth, so we have to group species together into plant functional types or certain trait distributions, and how those are defined greatly impacts carbon uptake or carbon exchange patterns. And not every plant is created equally. Some plants grow faster than others, allocate carbon into their roots or wood or leaves, or exudates to the soils, or defensive compounds, reproduction, differently from one another. There are differences in nutrient uptake, especially for nitrogen, phosphorus limitations. And there are differences in the soils in terms of carbon and nutrients, accessibility, concentrations, fluxes, and stocks. We need to understand how when a leaf or wood hits the ground, how does it decompose, and how are all these the dead plant material eaten by all the bugs and termites and bacteria and fungi and so on, which are not represented in the Earth system models. So again, simplifications, assumptions have to be made to represent them based on temperature or moisture and so on. And ultimately, we want to know, are ecosystems a net carbon sink or source? Is there more carbon going in through photosynthesis than is going out through respiration or fire and so on? And then the carbon cycle is directly tied to the water cycle. We can start with snow, and how do we melt snow? It's very easy to see, very hard to model. And some of that water will percolate or infiltrate into deep groundwater stores. Some of that water will evaporate back to the atmosphere along with the transpiration. And some of that water will run off into our rivers. how rivers are routed throughout the landscape is a very dynamic and heterogeneous process, not necessarily well captured in coarse models. And all of these water balance components need to balance with each other so that one stock doesn't overload from another. I don't have a good picture of water balance, so here's like some dude balancing over water. There are dynamic components that we need to understand. When a tree falls in the forest, which plant functional type, which traits, which species gets to occupy that space. And as new bioclimatic envelopes open up with a changing climate, again, which species, traits, plant functional types get to occupy those regions. Because there's competition. There's competition for space, for light, for water, for nutrients. And how do you kill a tree? How do you kill these plants? Ways to kill a tree, and there's also a lot of ways that plants can be adaptive and plastic and flexible and so on. And how do we represent disturbances, especially when there's the human element in it? And then ecosystems also feed back with trace gases and aerosols as well. So all of these processes are represented and wrapped up in these simple cartoons and these models. But when we walk through, a forest, we know that ecosystems are a lot more complicated than that, and they have all these processes that are occurring. And that's all well and good, but now you throw another wrench into the machinery, and that wrench looks like this. And we don't even need to put axes on this for us to know what this is, but for the students in the audience, you should put axes on your graphs. But it's that rise in CO2, which is changing everything. And so we have models that disagree, models that say, well, plants like CO2, they'll do better. And models that say, well, wait a second, the CO2 actually, changes the water cycle, causes more droughts, and plants don't like that. And the models continue to update, but the spread continues to stay pretty consistent. So I liken these projections and these differences of models to that old fable of the blind man and the elephant, where every person is saying something different, but everyone is saying something kind of similar, and we're all trying to understand what we cannot see, which is the future. And we all disagree and we all agree, and I think it's a matter of being able to piece these pieces together collaboratively and together to be able to understand the elephant in the room, or the future of the planet.
So Josh, what percolates from your slides is that the biosphere is an extremely complex system, and because of that, it's extremely difficult to simulate it in models. So it's the uncertainties, right, in this system. What percolates from your slide. So if you can go back to the Friedrichstein plot. Can you show that plot again, please?
Sure.
Because I think that's the key here, is that different models predict different scenarios about the capacity of future ecosystems to absorb CO2 and to slow down climate change. You can see this spaghetti plot here. Each of these lines represent a model, and you can see that each of them simulates a very different future. Some models predict that ecosystems in the future will continue absorbing increasing quantities of carbon dioxide, whereas some models predict that the land will actually become a source of CO2 instead of a sink. What I would like perhaps to highlight here is that it's not necessarily the models that are wrong. It's not necessarily bad model practice what drives this variation across models, but rather it's the lack of understanding of how ecosystems work what drives this this variation across models is that we don't really understand how future ecosystems, how the land will react to increasing levels of CO2. So the modelers are forced to make assumptions, and those different assumptions is what drives this variability across models. So, but my question is, what do you think are the largest uncertainties in our understanding of how the biosphere works and how we can improve that understanding to make better predictions of climate change?
Okay, so right. So what causes these differences, right? Why are we disagreeing? Why is the model that, Forrest Hoffman works on not agreeing with, CIA works on, and so on? Well, I mean, there's processes, there's plants, but there's biases, right? Everyone has our own biases in terms of our understanding, and our biases often come from our local conditions, right? So initially, a lot of the models were built on the data that were available, and the data that are easily available are often the data that are accessible from your backyard. And so this is a cartogram that I created on the land model development, like how many land models there were. And you can see that they're really developed heavily in the US and Europe and Australia and China and so on. But does this necessarily represent the functioning of the Earth? And if we look at kind of, how well the Earth is sampled or land is sampled, here's land, right? There's a little bit more land in the Northern Hemisphere. We know that most of the breathing of the biosphere, most of that carbon uptake is in the tropics, where there's a lot of carbon, but there's also a lot of carbon locked up in the Arctic and boreal region as well. So we've got these two poles of the carbon cycle that need to be really well sampled for us to understand what's happening globally. But as you can imagine, that our measurements again are in like the US and Europe and Australia and China and so on, and not necessarily in these two poles of the carbon cycle in the tropics and the Arctic boreal region. So this is where remote sensing can really help play a role. And we are in a bit of a golden age of, especially for terrestrial remote sensing, where we can see remotely every component of the water cycle. We can see many aspects of the carbon cycle and even the nutrient cycle. And so when you kind of put them together, we can have this feedback between water, carbon, and nutrients and climate as they impact climate and as climate impacts them. And I tend to look at it from a plant-centric point of view, but you can look at it from an atmospheric or ocean point of view as well. So in terms of uncertainties, like one of the kind of the big gems of the terrestrial biosphere would be Amazonia, which exerts a major global force on carbon cycling, water cycling, nutrient cycling, the home to the greatest biodiversity, and so on. And so we want to know how this gem, often called the lungs of the planet or the heartbeat of the planet, is going to behave into the future or respond. And so there are some models that project, this crashing, this dieback of the Amazon rainforest. And so we do a lot of work on that as well. But these models are projecting that we're going to have more droughts. They're going to be more frequent, more intense, larger. And are they really models or are they reality? Well, in 2005, it was the worst drought in the history of our records in the Amazon. In 2010, it was an even worse drought. And in 2015, it was worse. So this increasing frequency and magnitude of these droughts that were just projections in the future are now our reality. And they're happening so frequently that the forest can't recover. And so another big uncertainty that we look at as well is nutrients. And so this is a paper led by Terrer, and I was a co-author on it. And this is a cool graphic by Victor Leshik, who's an amazing artist and science communicator. And so one of the key uncertainties that were in a lot of models is that most of the models were missing nutrient cycle or nutrient limitations, especially nitrogen and phosphorus, which help control these knobs as we emit this sludge of CO2 over the planet, some of which can be turned into trees and biomass, but those knobs can be are controlled by nutrients. And this is a paper that Terrer put out earlier this year. Again, I was thankful to be on this, where we're starting to see where that carbon goes. Is it into the soil? Is it into above ground biomass? And what controls those knobs? Is it nutrients? Is it mycorrhizal fungi? And this was a paper that Terrer put out a few years ago now, about 5 years ago now, showing the importance of mycorrhizal fungi as a major knob to determining how carbon is taken up. One thing that I've been working on is being able to detect things, as we know that the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, or AM, associate with certain species, and the ectomycorrhizal fungi, or ECM, associate with other species. And do they kind of pulse the trees in common ways, even though this tree species are very different from one another? And sure enough, we could. So we published a few papers on that. And now we've started also putting these dynamics into global models. It's in, especially in CLM, but also we've been working with ELM in other models as well. And then we have other remote sensing techniques to be able to look at nutrient limitations using a combination of water cycle, carbon cycle, interactions to get nutrient limitations. If you know how much water and energy there is, there should be a certain amount of carbon there. But if there isn't, why not? Well, two reasons. You've either chopped down the carbon or there's not enough nutrients. And back to the uncertainties, most of this carbon uptake uncertainty is in the land, but what is it about the land? Where is that land? Where is the uncertainty in the land across these models? Is it in the nutrients? Is it in land use? Is it in climate? Most of the uncertainty is actually in the CO2 sensitivity itself. So if you chop down the trees, like land use, most of the models kind of agree what's going to happen. If you increase temperature or decrease rainfall, the models kind of agree with each other. But if you change CO2 by just a little bit, the models wildly disagree with one another. And that's that CO2 sensitivity. Where is this uncertainty? It's actually mostly in the tropics, where we have the very little data or no data in some cases. And so if we look at our CO2 uptake responses in our data, we have this wealth of information from free air CO2 enrichment experiments, or FACE experiments, where CO2 is pumped onto trees from, you can see from these rings, and we see what happens. But they're really expensive and require like an enormous amount of infrastructure. And how long are they going to last? They're going to last as long as your funding lasts, which is not necessarily the climatic scales that we're talking about when we're looking at these Friedlingstein plots or these climate projections. And we want to know how ecosystems will change over these time scales. And our FACE experiments don't necessarily capture that, especially with tree FACE experiments, maybe in the grasses and others. And then if we look at the tropics, right, they're extraordinarily diverse, right? And you would need to expand the rings out so significantly to capture the diversity of what's happening in the tropics. So we basically are stuck, and these are the reasons why we've not had a CO2 fertilization experiment in tropical rainforests, because of just the logistical constraints and costs and difficulties, even though we know that is one of our biggest uncertainties in the land contribution to climate projections. So we kind of know our uncertainties, and we've been also stuck with being able to deal with them. And so henceforth, we've had lots of papers, lots of models, lots of ways to get at it. But we just don't have the CO2 fertilization experiments at the size for the duration to be able to address these questions. And we've been stuck at this point on that.
So I understand from your slides that one of the greatest uncertainties among models is that the sensitivity of how the model understands that plants change their uptake of carbon dioxide with rising levels of CO2 changes is one of these the key reasons why there is this high uncertainty. But you also mentioned, I found that pretty remarkable and perhaps confusing, is that you showed some papers showing increases in droughts, so more frequent droughts in tropical forests, but at the same time, even the IPCC report suggests that there might be increases in precipitation in the coming decades with climate change. So how do you consolidate those two apparently contradictory indications that there might be more droughts, but also more precipitation? How do you consolidate those two apparently contradictory
Yeah, I mean, it just depends where it is, right? So you can have wet get wetter, dry drier, which is still a slightly controversial paradigm. You know, and we know with trapping energy, we just have more intensification of the hydrological cycle. I think again, still argued over and debated, but you know, I think a lot of the papers that have been coming out have shown this intensification of the hydrological cycle. So the droughts are droughtier, the floods are floodier, right? And so you just get this increased variability, which doesn't necessarily average out if you're a tree. You don't get to be like, I'll take all that rain and all that drought and be happy, right? So having those extremes are what impact the terrestrial biosphere for sure, and society, and our managed ecosystems as well, to be able to grow food for this growing population.
Do you think it's quite likely that, for example, Mediterranean ecosystems that are already currently dry might become drier in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a possibility for sure. There's like a constant changing dynamic. And so again, even if they became drier, right, is that the dominant factor that is going to play a role in the ecosystem response, or is the CO2 fertilization actually going to make those plants a little bit more water use efficient and happier or whatever it is, but are there enough nutrients there as well? So it's these dynamics, and then of course as humans continue to just expand into these areas as well. So I think we need to be a little bit careful about saying this is going to happen everywhere across these biomes, and this without understanding the bigger picture, and especially the human dimension we always forget about.
Yeah, and going back to carbon dioxide and this uncertainty in the sensitivity of the plant response to carbon dioxide. So our research, as you showed, has been showing based on CO2 manipulation experiments. What's our understanding of how plants respond to rising levels of CO2, whether they take up more carbon dioxide and slow down climate change or not? But you showed that there are no CO2 experiments in the tropics, even though tropical forests are the largest reservoirs of carbon in the world. So that for me, it's a huge uncertainty. It's quite contradictory, right? That tropical forests are the most important carbon sink, and yet we don't have experiments in tropical forests, so we don't really understand what might happen in the future in carbon uptake in tropical forests. So Josh, what do you think about how we can solve that uncertainty, and what are you actually doing in this direction to to improve our understanding of the capacity of tropical forests to take up CO2 in the future.
Yeah. So Julia Green asked an interesting question. Isn't there a face experiment in the Amazon, in Manaus? There definitely were a lot of plans, a lot of investments, and a lot of people working on that. As far as I know, the answer is still no, but it is a dynamic situation, so I may not be up to date. Last I heard, but pandemic time blurs everything, was that the American funders kind of pulled out and it didn't happen, but it's definitely like something that needs to happen for sure. Like that's a huge argument. But even if it were to happen, it's, you know, it's one site, the number of trees you could count on your hands kind of thing. Like how representative of that would be to like the tropical biome as a whole, and across those long time scales that we need. So absolutely we need that, and you know, it's still a big challenge. And Gerardo asks from Mexico, will the slides be available to the public? The whole thing is recorded, so I think, you know, you can get all this recorded. But back to your question, because I hope that kind of, and feel free to correct me, anyone in the audience, on the Manaus or the Amazon face experiments. There's also been like some tropical CO2 fertilization experiments on like seedlings and stuff like that. But so yeah, so what do we do? We've been stuck, and this is like what we need to know for the future. And sometimes when you have disciplinary barriers or boundaries, how do you break through? You can break through interdisciplinarily. So what is our crystal ball into the future of the Earth? Talked a lot about plants now. I'm going to talk about volcanoes. We often think of volcanoes as that kind of majestic peak in the background of this photo. We think of them as these eruptors of lava, you know, and magma and stuff like that. But the volcanic complex actually extends for miles beyond the crater, beyond that peak there, beneath the underlying forests. And if we think about, you know, before a volcano is formed, here we've got this landscape of trees, and then the volcano forms thousands of years ago, and there's these cracks and fissures throughout the landscape. The number one dry gas that comes out of these cracks and fissures is CO2. And it comes out with extraordinarily high concentrations, thousands of ppm, much higher than, you know, we would ever be interested in as ecologists. But they diffuse, you know, along somewhat predictable gradients until they reach background concentrations. And so it's this gradient along, you know, the source to the background that are of the concentrations that we're interested in. It's the same types of concentrations that are part of the FACE experiments. And they kind of represent this window into the future. And so this is, you know, and the CO2 comes out continuously for the entire life of the volcano, thousands of years, hundreds of years, whatever it might be. And so we now have this kind of like long-term natural CO2 fertilization experiment that Mother Nature has provided us, instead of us needing to build those pipes in. Those pipes are built for us. The volcanic CO2 also has a different isotopic signature than background atmospheric CO2. So if you are to sample the tree wood for isotopes, the wood isotopic signature of trees exposed to elevated volcanic CO2 is now more similar to the isotopic signature of volcanic CO2. And so you can actually trace that historic record through the entire lifetime of the trees, decades. So I started working with volcanologists for the past 5 years or so, looking at this and trying to see if we can use volcanoes as a means to kind of break through this barrier. And the volcanologists are also very interested in the ecology side as well, because the number one early indicator of a big disaster, a big volcanic eruption, is CO2. The CO2 kind of gets pushed up before the lava comes out. And so volcanologists try to monitor and measure the CO2 at all these volcanoes where there's millions and millions of people living around. But the CO2 sensors are very expensive and they get damaged very easily. And so actually most of these volcanoes are not very well monitored for CO2. And now as an ecologist, we're telling the volcanologists, we've got your CO2 sensors and we've got thousands of them, and they're called trees. And so they're very interested in that as well. So we're interested in looking at the response of ecosystems to this elevated CO2, and we have the measurements to detect structure, biomass through LiDAR, the composition or traits through hyperspectral measurements or spectroscopic measurements, evapotranspiration, water cycling through thermal measurements, fluorescence to get at kind of a photosynthetic activity. And these different lenses, like an RGB lens, can come together and paint the true picture of CO2 on the landscape. And so then how do we know where the CO2 is coming out from the landscape? Well, we've also been working with drones, these fixed wing drones where you can put LiCor sensors and CO2 sensors in. And they fly close to the treetops, sniffing out the CO2 leaks so we know where these experiments are basically set up by Mother Nature. We've been doing a lot of work in Costa Rica where there's this chain of volcanoes, different ages, different species, biodiversity compositions, some drier, some wetter. Barva has been extinct for thousands of years, so it's kind of like a control site. And we've been going in and trying to figure out, is there a crystal ball into the future of the planet hidden in these jungles of the volcanoes? Is there something that we can learn about how much CO2 is being taken up now or throughout the past 10, 100 years that will tell us what's going to happen over the next 100 years? And these are pretty dynamic landscapes to work in. So this is an example. I took this picture of this double rainbow because it was a pretty double rainbow. But what's also nice is that you can see the kind of steam rising out in the middle. And that's actually one of these giant Mother Nature pipes where the CO2 is also coming out in high concentrations. So this is one of those areas where the CO2 is coming out and going onto the trees, and the trees are doing whatever they're doing with the elevated CO2. And so it's a matter of us trying to go in and figure out what is the CO2 effect. So working with some of my colleagues on measuring this, and I think I saw Caroline Familietti, who was at JPL with me for a while, who worked on this as well. Right, so basically kind of bringing these two communities together in a way that they haven't really interacted, like two black holes orbiting. And when they come together, maybe they'll produce gravitational waves of information that tells us about our future of the universe.
Okay, that's pretty cool. So Josh, we've been talking about uncertainties in climate models and some poor understanding of how ecosystems work and how they can respond to rising levels of CO2. But perhaps it's important to highlight that this doesn't mean that future projections of the climate are wrong, correct?
Well, I mean, they can't all be right.
Yeah, but I mean, what I try to convey is that climate change is real and it's happening fast, right? So, yeah. But it's our job to talk about the uncertainties to try to make better models, better predictions.
Yeah, I mean, definitely in terms of climate communication, right? That's important for all of us, scientists, to be able to understand how what we say is interpreted and understood by others who are not necessarily scientists. So, what I often say in my climate communications, there's, we all agree that there's climate change. As you said, it's happening, it's fast, it's real. What we disagree on is like the exact impacts or exactly how much that change is going to be. But we know there's definitely change. So, yeah. So when we talk about uncertainty, it's that part of the coin, not the first part of it.
Exactly. I wanted to make that clear, but it's really cool that with this natural carbon dioxide experiment, we could potentially see a window into the future to better understand how future ecosystems might respond to rising levels of CO2 at the end of the century or farther. So we are getting closer to the hour. So I would like to end my questions asking you what's the legacy perhaps that you would like to leave in the field in the coming years and decades. How do you see your research shaping science and climate science?
Yeah, I mean, the impact and legacy, it's not a question I ever really kind of thought of in the beginning of my career. It's more like, can I do science? You know, can I publish papers? Can I get a job? And then at JPL was like, can I, you know, lead to getting a mission or something like that, you know, contributing. And it's always been just like, what's right in front of you. But as I've gone into my, you know, stepping into that mid-career now, and making this change away from JPL into some different, you know, commercial world, university world, and, you know, and still open to collaborations with all my colleagues and, you know, anyone who's interested. I'm starting to ask, like, my career, like, I've published a lot of papers. Do I want to publish a lot more papers in the next half, or is there something else, you know, out there? So I started thinking about it, but it's not really like a goal of mine to like necessarily leave a legacy, although it's nice to be appreciated. I think ultimately I enjoy science, and, you know, as long as you can find a home that appreciates you and where you can, you know, do that science, that's important. But there are some things that I'm proud of and that I'm working on that excite me, and I can talk about a little bit of those. So one cool paper that one of my students has worked on, which is now in review at, that's not at PNAS anymore, it's at Nature, one of the Nature journals, which is that we can now use the soil moisture record from space, and we are able to predict every single food crash, food security crash in our satellite record with like 3 to 6 months lead time. And we use this like tipping point theory and satellite data. And so this paper nobody knows about because it's in review, but when it gets published, I hope it will make a really big impact. I'm really proud of what my student did and what I worked with him, Krishnamurthy, on. It's really cool stuff. So that's one thing that's pretty exciting to me. Another aspect that, again, back to this interdisciplinarity, is that I've been working a lot with artists and designers. Again, back to this notion of it's important to do the science we do, but it may be more important to communicate the science that we do. And so I've been now teaming up with artists and designers where we have all this data, and can we actually use it to improve society and for both adaptation and mitigation and in climate, you know, in response to climate. And can we now understand what designers go through and what artists go through to be able to convey and get people to use products for, you know, whether they're designing the next Nike shoe or Tesla car, but now the products are data, and they're for farmers and water managers and land managers and politicians and so on to use those data. So EcoStress was something that was a mission that we launched in 2018, and I was the science lead for that. And that was something that I'm also very proud of as well, to go from this concept of needing certain types of data to address key questions to getting something launched. And I have like a little short video just to introduce EcoStress. And this was a video that we had made before we launched, but I still like to use it. So there's a little bit of audio. We're interested in our ability to sustain food production. We're interested in our ecosystem health, and that's all tied to water. How much water our plants, our crops need, we want to know. And as water resources become more uncertain, more variable, we need to really track that really precisely. We can't just guess anymore.
So EcoStress is going to measure the surface temperature, and then we're going to use that surface temperature to be able to determine how much water the plants that we're looking at are using.
We'd like to show how we can use EcoStress data to optimize agricultural water use.
EcoStress is an instrument that's going to go on the International Space Station. It stands for the Ecosystem Spaceborne Thermal Radiometer Experiment on Space Station.
It focuses on how much water plants use all over the planet and how much water plants need, and if there's stress, water stress or heat stress that plants are facing.
We can measure the surface temperature of the Earth within a few tenths of a degree, and then we can use that information to look at objects on the surface of the Earth, and in this particular case we're interested in looking at plants.
Plants, as they start to suffer from heat or water stress, they begin to heat up in a similar way to a human with a fever. We can pick up that stress before the plant is visibly affected. So there's this window where water resource management and agricultural users can actually allocate more water before they die, before the damage is irreparable.
The space station is going to fly over at different times to be able to look at how the stress is changing through the day and allow us to characterize vegetation in ways that we've never been able to characterize it before. The instrument itself is looking down at the surface of the Earth, and it uses a mirror that rotates to scan across the surface. This measurement's being made in microseconds, but it's enough time for us to measure the energy that's coming off it and then translate that energy into a temperature.
The temperature measurements from EcoStress can detect volcanoes. We can detect urban heat from cities.
So although we're focused primarily on looking at plants and making sure that we can maximize the amount of food that we can get back for the water that we use, the mission can be used for many other purposes. What hasn't been possible in the past is to make the measurements as frequently as we need to make them with sufficient detail, and it's that combination that is so important. And really that's just a reflection of the improvements in technology.
Our ability to sustain livelihoods, food production, ecosystems, and the health of the planet through EcoStress data is invaluable. So EcoStress is definitely great for a lot of these aspects, but there's more to be done. And what we really need for water management and managing our food production is to get daily field scale measurements. And so that's the next thing that I'm working on with Hydrosat, where we are now creating this constellation of thermal infrared small sats to get at that this next generation in measurement capabilities. So I'm really excited about Hydrosat as well, using this kind of cutting edge CubeSat generation to really be able to drill down into being able to help manage our water and our food. And just the last slide I have here on this topic is a paper that I published earlier this year in JGR, and it's called Once Upon a Time in Ameriflux. And one of the key points, the first key point, talks about diversity, equity, inclusion, and how obviously we're in an enormous groundswell movement of DEI, but even before the groundswell, when we're talking about climate change in our global planet, it's about working together and understanding these multiple voices in the room, differences, and understanding our own personal biases. And as we work towards this in the future, it aligns, these types of objectives align with similar types of objectives with DEI. And this paper talks about both diversity, equity, inclusion as keys to science communication and doing science in general. And the paper also has interesting commentary on how we communicate science, because I have written this paper in the form of a fairy tale, so you should definitely check it out. So, ultimately, we are talking about the princess and the pea, and we're trying to figure out what's the true royalty, what's the true future, what's the elephant look like, in the room, because at the end of the day, we all want to live happily ever after.
All right, thank you so much, Josh. I have a million questions, but we are getting closer to the hour. Actually,
sorry, Professor, there are a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to perhaps start with Amy Austin asked, doesn't the uncertainty related to deforestation and associated human-induced fires in the Amazon eclipse the uncertainty related to CO2 sensitivity of intact tropical forests?
Yeah, it's a good question, Amy. And the same can be said about a number of different processes, especially like water related processes. People often ask, like, what is the water stress? And there's a difference between like uncertainty in process and uncertainty in the model projections. Those types of processes are definitely super uncertain in terms of process, but there are some data, whereas there's like no data on the CO2 fertilization uptake response in the tropics, which is why the models wildly disagree. So if you look at kind of the model into comparison projects from Trendy or Misty MIP, where they isolate land use versus nitrogen deposition versus CO2 sensitivity, the biggest uncertainties come from that change in CO2 alone. So that's not to say that these processes aren't super important and super critical and also really uncertain from a process standpoint. My comment was more just like how the models are built and constrained. Yeah, hopefully that kind of addresses that a little bit.
Okay, and we have a raised hand. If you can, feel free.
And Samuel Raymond also asked a question.
Yeah, we have a question from Sam. Okay. So what do you see as some of the physical computer modeling challenges for this intersection of fields? And this is where you were talking about the Costa Rica project.
Yeah, I might actually address that question from a broader perspective, because you know, we're in this data revolution, this information age, where we now have just tremendous amounts of data, right? Oh, we need more resolution. We need more spatial resolution, more temporal resolution, more spectral resolution. And so then the engineers are like, we can get to that. And then the scientists are like, wait, hold up, I actually can't handle all of that data. My laptop is only so big, and my input output you know, streams are only so big. So you know, NASA's working in Indian Space Agency are working on NISAR. NASA's working on a mission called SPG, which has a hyperspectral and thermal. And NISAR alone, I think, and SWAT as well with radar, is going to produce more data than every single Earth mission combined has ever produced. I think that was the stat I read. In working with EcoStress alone at 70 meter pixels every few days, it's a lot of data. Like it would take you a year in real time to download all the data and like reproject it and like do any kind of analysis on it. And so as we move forward into the future of data, we have to kind of rethink our paradigm of how we do analysis. And it's going to be less on the scale or on the paradigm of downloading data to your laptop and doing an analysis, and more on the scale of uploading your analysis code to the data source and then re-downloading the results. And those platforms are still in their infancy. You know, a lot of people use Google Earth Engine, and there's some cloud aspects, but you know, I think that is something that we definitely need to address. And as the new professors, like Professor Terrer is teaching, you know, their students, we need to think about those as the next generation of how we do these types of analyses.
Okay, let's go to finally to the raise hand. Feel free to ask your question.
Rahul, do you want to ask a question?
Hello, sir. I'm Rahul Kashyap, a doctoral researcher at Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur, first year student. Sir, I am working in the field of atmosphere-land interaction, and my study is pretty much related to your theme of terrestrial bioproduction and all. I want to ask, sir, what is the major cause of the browning of the terrestrial ecosystems in the recent, like say, 20 years, especially in the vast spaces of the tropical regions of the Africa, savannas, also the Amazon basin, and also in some parts of Asia.
So you're focusing more on the browning, less on the greening?
It's like browning is a major concern. Greening is good. Like we are not focusing much. Like I am focusing both on the browning and greening, but browning is a major concern. Like what are the causes? Why it is?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I just figure I'd clarify because I think a lot of people have been talking about the greening more these days, right? Like what's causing the greening? Is it real? The browning, I think it's, a lot of, I mean, it's like anything that can kill something that's green, right? So whether it's water or disease or fire or humans, I think are usually the causes for the browning. I don't do a lot of work on that, so there might be people in the audience who can elaborate more, but it's changing water cycles, as we talked about before, as well as temperature, CO2 causing pests, and vulnerability to fires, humans coming in with fire or grazing or degradation and so on.
So like if we take the instance of fire, like how do we separate that climate change induced fire from the human like anthropogenic induced fire? Do we have any like thing to separate both things out? Like how can we say this is human induced and this is natural climate induced? Like fire is also cycle, right? Fire is also part of the natural cycle.
Yeah, it's hard to separate them for sure. I mean, humans have a big role in fire. I mean, there's fire, by lightning strikes. But there's ultimately some human fingerprint on all of that. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say we should try to separate the human and natural aspects. The humans are the big players when it comes to most of the fires that we've been talking about. But there are the natural, or I guess natural, like kind of the more climatic links in terms of the dryness, right? Air dryness, plant dryness, and so on. And so those, I think, are very interesting, especially with the data that we produce from missions like EcoStress or Hydrosat and so on, where we can start to look at that dryness before the fires occur, and then they can start to help understand where the fires are going to lead into. And we can also use the data to see how the ecosystems recover and change post-fire, which may not be what they were before.
The dryness can be at different levels. Like for land dryness, we can see the soil moisture trends. For the vegetation, I can think we can see evapotranspiration probably. And for atmosphere, we can see vapor pressure deficit. That is VPD data is also available from Terrer Climate. Those things we can see, but that might not be in sync. Like VPD, soil moisture trend, and evapotranspiration might not always be in sync. That there might be lag. So it is difficult to pinpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are good points, Rahul. I mean, the lags are really important, especially in cumulative effects, right? So you can have it be dry one day, or hot one day, and then it's fine the next day. And does that really impact the plants? Or you can have it moderately dry and moderately hot for many days, and it's that accumulation of conditions that start to stress the plants and make them more vulnerable to burn conditions or burn spread conditions.
And so finally, one non-technical question: how does it feel like to be growing in a field from switching from JPL to industrial world? Like how it is experience?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's I think a lot of students are wondering like, oh, where am I going to go after I graduate? And paths are often
exactly.
very sinuous. I ended up taking the job at JPL because my partner got a university position nearby, and I had colleagues at JPL. And so it was a great place, and I love my time there. Going into the commercial world, I had this like healthy skepticism. I'm like, oh, those guys are just like capitalists who just want to make a lot of money. But I'm starting to drink the commercial Kool-Aid a little bit, so to speak, just like I drank the NASA Kool-Aid, and I was all like NASA, I still am. But what's different so in the commercial world with Hydrosat, we're all about giving the data for free to all the science community. Like so that's part of my job as a science lead, is to make sure all the science community get the data, just like I did for EcoStress, and help publish papers and so on. And then they make their money with the big agribusiness firms or whoever need it for operational management. But one thing that I did a lot of, which you could kind of sense of during my time at JPL, was applied science. Really helping communicate, get people to use the data. And in the commercial world, they're like the ultimate applied scientists. They're the ones who actually are working with those customers or those users to make sure everyone's really happy with the data and getting the data. On the NASA side, it was given a lot of lip service and not a lot of funding. And so, you know, most of it was creating data and kind of lobbing it over the wall and hoping people run with it. And people did. But on the commercial side, it is that over the wall where people are running with it. So they're also not as different as I expected. At JPL, we were constantly trying to propose missions and you know, promote our stuff and, you know, and win grants. And on the commercial side, it's similar. The business guys are talking to investors and whatnot. And so, you know, I'm still new to it and exploring. And then in the university world is as what you know, but there's a really great joy that I receive from teaching and working with students, whether it's my interns, my former interns like Caroline, who I see on here, or others, but now doing it much more systematically. I think that's a great joy and legacy, to refer to Cesar's earlier question, that I get, that you don't necessarily always get working at a pure research institute like JPL, where you know, you have your students and interns that come in, but it's not like your classes that you can really build up and build knowledge. So yeah, lots of different options out there, and there's no one right path or just different places to do similar things.
Thanks a lot, sir.
All right, everyone. I think it's time we expanded. We went a bit beyond the hour, but thank you so much for coming to the first Climate Snacks. And we have some very exciting confirmations for the future. So we will plan to do this monthly. So stay tuned for more Climate Snacks. The idea is that over time, we get out of academia more and more. So that's our goal. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and Ana do Campo for organizing. All right. See you guys.
All right, thanks, Cesar, and thanks for having me. Good to hang out with you and chat with you. And we will talk soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you so much, guys.